Hi, everyone. It's Monday. It's the first day of class. So welcome here. I don't know if anyone is watching live right now, but I hope that you do take a chance to take a look at these videos. So what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time, I'm thinking maybe 20 or 30 minutes each day to talk a little bit about the sources, particularly the sources that are in the Going to the Source book. So what I'm anticipating is by the time you've read the Going to the Source material, and by the time that you're watching the video, you will have read the textbook, and in the case of this week and some of next week, to watch the short video lecture by Edward O'Donnell from the Great Courses. And that should give you a sense of a context and a sense of background. And what I want to do is to sort of shift the focus and shift the discussion onto how do historians think about primary sources, and to take a look at the kind of primary sources that we have in our source book that you can then use to start to form your own conclusions. And the way that you'll be doing that is in those forums, and you'll see those forums. It's Monday through Thursday today because there's a shorter essay that you'll be doing from Friday into the weekend. But most days you'll have these short forums. And if you haven't looked at it yet, what you'll see is that the forum is structured as basically two thesis statements, fairly elaborate thesis statements. They're actually kind of short paragraphs, each one. And usually they will be fairly oppositional positions, but both positions are authentic positions in the sense that historians at some point in time have made each of the thesis statements that I'm giving you. So what I'm asking you to do is to say, okay, these are two ways of interpreting this historical event or this historical moment. And how do I then take the primary sources that I'm looking at and make a conclusion as to which one is most persuasive or which one wins me over? Okay, so the sources that we're looking at today in the Going to the Source book are photographs. And so what I wanted to talk a little bit about is how we think about photographs as sources, and some thoughts. I want to point out some things that might be going on in a couple of the specific photos in the Going to the Source book that might give you a sense for thinking about how to interpret them. So all of the photos in chapter 1 of Going to the Source, you can see, are from the Blackfeet Indian tribe in Montana, and particularly the community around Glacier National Park. I just want to say something to contextualize this a little bit, because the relationship between American Indians and the creation of the national park system, which is one of the great creations of the late 19th century, Theodore Roosevelt is sort of famous as being one of the most vigorous conservationists and creators of the national park system. The earliest national park, Yellowstone, was in the late 19th century, the 1860s, 1870s. And the United States was actually the first country in the world to have a national park system. So it became something of a defining mark of national identity and a source of national pride, justifiably so. But what's interesting to think about it in relationship with American Indians is, let's take this back to the question, what would be the purpose of having a national park system? Why would national parks exist in the first place? Well, the argument that was always made, which you can probably think of for yourself, is to have a sort of pristine space. Untouched wilderness was the idea of the national park system, that Americans, particularly Eastern Americans, Midwestern Americans that were living in big crowded cities with lots of factories, living further and further from the land, needed some escape to wilderness, pristine, untouched wilderness. And so the idea of the national parks was a way of having a place for beleaguered Eastern industrial moderns to go so that they could experience untouched wilderness. The irony here is they were pitched as pristine places where people didn't live, but of course people did live there. The Indians lived there. And so what we're actually seeing in some of these photos is two things happening. National parks are created as sort of sanctuary spaces that are empty of human habitation, but they're empty because the Indians who used to live there had been removed to reservations outside the national park territory. So there's a kind of interesting relationship when we see some of the Blackfeet Indians in the photos at Glacier National Park. This was their ancestral homeland, which is now being essentially marketed to Americans from the East as untrammeled, unpopulated wilderness. So that's part of the background to keep in mind here. So let's think a little bit about the nature of the photographs themselves as historical sources. Some of this is covered by the authors, but I wanted to highlight just a couple of things. I think it's common for people to think if I were to give you a couple of sources, and I say one is a written source, it's a written document, and the other is a photograph, and I ask you which is the better representation of the truth. A lot of people will tend to go with the photograph, and the reason is pretty clear. People tend to think that photography is neutral and objective in a way that a written document could never be. The reason is because obviously people have to, if you're writing a document, if you're writing a text, you're choosing words, you're putting those words into order, you're shifting things around, and there's no way that you can possibly capture in words the totality of the environment or the moment. And there's a sense that photography is unmediated in a way that written texts can never be. I would challenge that a little bit. It's true that photographs give us a sense of space and can allow us to have a sense of dating events that texts can't always do. But we need to start with the assumption, I would argue, and I would argue for you in looking at these photographs here, we need to start with the assumption that photographs are texts in a similar way that written texts are texts, in the sense that both of them have authors, both of them have creators, and both of them are attempting to do something. They're attempting to communicate something. So I don't think that we should assume that photography, simply because it's depicting, you can see a reality there, that it's a value neutral reality, or that it's a reality that hasn't been specifically created by a photographer. This is particularly the case, I think, with these photos that we're talking about today, precisely because of the fact that, as far as we can tell, as far as I can tell, none of these photographs were actually taken by American Indians for their own purposes. So if we were to be suspicious of a government report, for instance, from the late 19th century written by a white Indian agent, and we would say, well, we're going to be a little suspicious of some of the conclusions that he might draw about Indian society, I think we have to have the same skepticism, or at least the same skeptical prism, for looking at some of these photographs, which have specific purposes in some cases, and which are not taken by Indians for their own uses. So that raises the question, okay, well, why are they being taken? What uses are they being used for? And the book does a pretty good job of articulating that there's essentially two categories that they're drawing on. The first categories are, I think, any biases or perspective are pretty clear in it, in that they're coming from Glacier National Park for commercial purposes. They're basically advertisements. So how do you read an ad? What kind of questions would you have about an image that you saw that is trying to convince you to associate a particular product with a particular image, or a particular brand with a particular vibe? Like, why is Michael Jordan associated with Nikes, right? Why does Nike want you to have that association, right? Well, the same question applies here. Why does Glacier National Park want its viewing public, which is Eastern, white, and affluent, to think about Indians in this particular way? What do they want this audience to see? And then how do we then read that as a depiction of some kind of reality of Indian life? So that's the first point. The second point are the other photographs that are amateur photographs, photographs that are not taken specifically for a commercial purpose, but have been collected at some point in various archives around the country that researchers have found and looked at. In general, we can probably say that the amateur photographs are going to be at least less varnished, probably have less of a particular commercial purpose, probably less of an ideological purpose. But we might still say, do we see things in those pictures that either conform or contradict the more manufactured images that we see in the advertisements and the photographs that are designed for an Eastern audience? So those are kind of the two main things that you were thinking of. The text also makes a key point that in both cases, the assumption of most Americans in the late 19th century was that the Indians were a vanishing people, that this was very sort of social Darwinist. The idea was that Indians were soon to be essentially an extinct peoples. And one of the reasons that photographers came to the West was to try to document what they thought were the last of the Indians, which mercifully we know today there are still Native American tribes, Native American cultures, Native American languages, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of these people that were taking these pictures thought that they were sort of capturing the last stages or the last vestiges of a people that they thought was going to vanish. So that's probably informing some of the thinking here. Okay, so I wanted to just point out a couple of particular photos and just kind of give you some food for thought as you're thinking about what is it that we're seeing here? Are we seeing a people that have been, whose culture has been largely defeated by the advance of American, white Anglo-American civilization? Or are we seeing people kind of creatively adapt circumstances and adapt their cultures to that new circumstance, and the culture is still a vital traditional culture that's adapted to modernity? That's essentially the main question. So a couple of particular photographs that I wanted to point to. So all of the ones that I want to point to actually are amateur photos, with the exception of maybe one. The first one is, take a look at number 6, this picture of the old Rations place. What do we make of a photograph like this? Now, I point to this particular photo because it doesn't look like there's a lot going on in it, particularly compared to the more manufactured photographs that we saw in the ads to Glacier National Park, the spearfishing or the reading a Western or the serving as a caddy for golfers. Those are full of action, but of course they're designed to be. And this picture of the old Rations place, it looks, the people's faces aren't very distinct. It can be hard to make out what, if anything, is going on there. And it doesn't seem like there's a lot of action in it. So what do you do with a photograph like this? Well, I want to put that in a little bit of context for you as a way of thinking about it. So what is the old Rations place? Well, as the caption describes, this is a place where Indians would go to get government rations, which were essentially their compensation, food rations, which were their compensation for losing large tracts of land. But this is a complicated business. And there's a tremendous, really kind of tragic irony here. As far back as the 1830s, the U.S. Supreme Court had described American Indian tribes as, the phrase that the Supreme Court used in this major case in the 1830s was domestic dependent nations. What's interesting about this phrase is a dependent nation. How can a nation be a sovereign nation but be dependent on another nation? Well, this seems like a contradiction. And in fact, for Indians who were in the Trans-Mississippi West in the 1830s, where there were very few white settlers, they in fact were not at all dependent on the United States. They were completely independent nations. But gradually, as westward expansion consumed more and more of this territory, and the Indians started to move onto reservations and sold either legally or through questionable means tracts of land, and started to move onto reservations. This notion of a domestic dependent nation had the power of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Or in other words, as Indians lost the autonomy of the land, they did in fact become dependent on the American government to provide them with things that had once been that they had done independently. So when we look at a picture like this, I think it's useful to think of it through the perspective of what this would have been like for Indian peoples whose culture was centrally oriented around the hunt and around the independence and the self-sovereignty that had been governed around the fact that one of the central cultural acts in Indian societies, Western Indian societies, was hunting. You can't get further away or more opposite from the hunt to being given government rations at a handout place. So I think that there might be some psychological elements that you might be able to read into a photograph like this. Even though it doesn't look like much is going on there, think of the context of what it means to be receiving rations as payment on land that you used to hunt. That's, I think, one point. I'm just going to talk a little bit quickly about a couple of other photographs that we might be able to similarly think about some of the context that's going on here. Number 10, this picture of the Mad Plume family harvest from 1920. Again, it looks pretty straightforward, right? It's two parents and their two children laying out their harvest. Well, again, there's a way that we can put a little more context to something like this. Not that it tells us exactly what it means, but just as a way of thinking about a way that we might read it. So what we see here, what strikes me, at least, one of the things that I think about when I look at this is we're seeing essentially a nuclear family in the practice of settled agriculture. Now, what was the central goal of American Indian policy since the late 1880s? That was crystallized in what was known as the Dawes Severalty Act. There was a question about this. If you haven't taken it yet, this is a preview. There will be a question about the Dawes Act in the quiz, because the Dawes Act is really one of the central pieces of Indian legislation of the 19th century. Really, it's probably one of the most transformative pieces of American legislation that has affected Indians in all of American history. And the goal of the Dawes Act was to take land that had been given to tribes, reservation land that was held collectively as a tribe, and to break that up into little individual allotments, and to then give those little allotments to nuclear families for settled agriculture. And the idea is that if you destroyed the sense of tribal identity, you would civilize the Indians and bring them closer to a Western style nuclear family settled agriculture. They would transition away from being savage, quote unquote, hunters to settled farmers. So what do we see here? And how do we read that family picture in the context of the Dawes Act? Is this evidence of the success of the Dawes Act? If it is evidence of the success of the Dawes Act in creating settled agriculture, does that then imply that it was also successful in destroying traditional Indian culture? Because that was clearly part of the aim and intent. So that's a question that we might think of as going on in that photo. The last one that I wanted to mention here is photo number 12, the picture of the Cutbank boarding school, the sewing class. One of the things that we might think about in that photo, again, this is an amateur photo, and it looks pretty straightforward, right? It's a bunch of female students in what looked mostly to be Western style dress, sitting around sewing machines. But I think one of the questions that you might ask of this photo or this source goes along with the question that we might also ask of the Mad Plume family photo. And that concerns how is the transition to reservation life and the ascent of modernity affecting the structure of American Indian families and traditional gender roles. So in most American Indian cultures, at least in the centuries before the arrival of whites in the Trans-Mississippi West, one of the primary activities of men was to hunt, and one of the primary activities of women was the domestic work of raising children and cooking, preparing food. The idea of settled agriculture, one of the reasons that American Indian tribes so strenuously resisted exactly what the Dawes Act was trying to do is because they associated settled agriculture with women's work, and Indian men did not want to lose the way that they defined their manhood, which was hunting. So we've seen in the old rations photo, okay, that old vision of American Indian manhood has been pretty well destroyed. Well, what's happening to traditional American Indian women's roles? I wonder if this gives us a hint at that. And I wonder if that causes us to think about how American Indian family dynamics might be unsettled by this transition, particularly because it's perfectly possible that the girls and the women who come out of the boarding school with this sort of technical training, there might actually be like a wage earning potential in this. Does this shift the balance of power in Indian families? Does it destabilize Indian traditions in a way if American Indian women are being prepared for wage earning jobs that are roughly conforming to what American Indian women would have done before, but before they were doing it in the context of the family and the tribe, and now they're doing it in the context of the marketplace. So do we get any sense from these photos of that being affected at all? Okay, so I don't want to keep you here forever. I just wanted to share my thoughts on some of these photos, particularly photos where if you look at it, it might not look like much is going on. And I wanted to suggest ways that you can continue to think about photos, even photos that look pretty straightforward or that look like there's not much is happening, that there are still questions that we can ask and ways that we can put those photos in a context and lead us into the act of historical interpretation. So obviously it's up to you to decide how you want to interpret these and where you want to go with the thesis questions that are laid out for you. But hopefully this gives you sort of a good starting point. So by the end of the day today, you'll finish the quiz. You'll give me the worksheet for these photographs. And again, I'm looking for maybe 2 to 3 sentences for each. I'm not looking for a treatise here. I want to see that you've looked at it, you've examined it, and you've thought about it. And treat the worksheet as basically you're annotating the sources. You're annotating it for yourself so that you can turn it into a more developed thought in the forum. And then finally, you'll post in the forum. This forum will stay open for the rest of the week. So if you want to go back and comment on another student, you will be able to do that throughout the rest of the week, but you won't see any other comments until you post. So after you post, you will then see other students' comments, and you'll be able to do that. If you have any questions in the meantime, let me know. And if not, I'll be back here again at 2 o'clock tomorrow to talk about the sources for the newspaper sources that we'll be reading in context with the Pullman strike. Okay, hope you're doing well. See ya.